Ernest Shackleton stood on the deck of the Endurance and watched his ship die. The ice had been squeezing it for months, slow, relentless, crushing pressure that twisted the wooden beams and splintered the masts. On November 21, 1915, the ship finally gave up. "She's going, boys," Shackleton shouted. And then, with a groan that sounded almost human, Endurance tilted, cracked, and sank beneath the ice. 28 men stood watching their only way home disappear into the frozen sea. They were in the middle of Antarctica. No radio, no rescue. No one even knew they were in trouble. And winter was coming. This was supposed to be the greatest expedition in polar history. Shackleton wanted to be the first person to cross Antarctica on foot, 1,800 miles from one side of the continent to the other, passing directly over the South Pole. The Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had already reached the pole in 1911, beating Britain's Robert Falcon Scott in a race that ended with Scott and his entire team frozen to death on the return journey. So crossing the entire continent, that was the last great achievement left, and Shackleton was determined to claim it. He recruited a crew of 27 men, scientists, sailors, engineers, a photographer, even a stowaway. The ship was called Endurance, named after Shackleton's family motto, "By endurance we conquer." It was a 3-masted wooden sailing ship, built specifically for polar ice, with extra thick planks designed to withstand crushing pressure. Shackleton paid £1,000 for it, a fortune. On August 8, 1914, just days after World War I began, the Endurance left England and sailed south toward Antarctica. By December 5, 1914, they'd reached South Georgia Island, a desolate whaling station in the sub-Antarctic. The whalers there warned Shackleton that this was an unusually cold summer. The sea ice was thicker and more extensive than normal. Shackleton ignored them. On December 5, the Endurance sailed into the Weddell Sea, heading for the Antarctic coast. For the first month, everything went well. The ship pushed through the pack ice, making slow but steady progress. The crew was in high spirits. Shackleton was a masterful leader. He kept morale high by joking with the men, playing cards, hosting sing-alongs after dinner. There were 69 sled dogs on board, barking and howling. There was even a cat named Mrs. Chippy, who belonged to the ship's carpenter. It felt like an adventure. But on January 19, 1915, the Endurance became stuck. The ice closed in around the ship like a fist. The crew tried everything, sawing through the ice, using explosives, ramming the ship forward, but nothing worked. The ice was too thick, and it was still summer. When winter came, it would only get worse. For the next 10 months, the Endurance drifted with the ice. Trapped and helpless, the crew set up camp on the ice around the ship, building makeshift shelters and killing seals for food. At first they thought they'd be able to break free when the ice thawed in spring. But the ice didn't thaw. Instead, it started moving. Massive pressure ridges grinding together, pushing upward into jagged mountains of ice, and the Endurance was caught in the middle. The pressure was unimaginable. The ship's wooden beams groaned and cracked. The mast snapped. The deck buckled. Shackleton ordered the crew to abandon ship on October 27, 1915, and they watched as the ice slowly crushed their only hope of survival. But here's the thing, Shackleton never panicked. When the ship sank, he gathered his men and told them they were going to walk to safety. The nearest land was Paulet Island, about 350 miles away. If they could reach it, there was an emergency supply depot left by a previous expedition. So they loaded 3 lifeboats onto sleds and started dragging them across the ice. Each lifeboat weighed about a ton. The ice was broken, jagged, unstable. The men sank to their knees in snow with every step. After 2 days, they'd traveled less than 2 miles. It was hopeless. Shackleton made the hardest decision of the expedition. They would set up camp on the ice and wait. They'd drift with the current and hope it carried them north, toward open water. They called it Patience Camp. For the next 4 months, 28 men lived on a floating ice floe in the middle of the Antarctic winter. Temperatures dropped to 1°F. Blizzards raged for days. Their tents were made of thin canvas. You could see the moon through them. They slept in reindeer hide sleeping bags that were constantly soaked with condensation and sweat. They ate seals and penguins. When food ran low, they started killing the sled dogs. It was brutal. The dogs had been with them since the beginning, loyal, hard-working companions, but there was no choice. They couldn't feed them, and they couldn't take them all. So one by one, the dogs were shot. Now pay attention to this part, because this is where it gets even more desperate. On April 9, 1916, the ice floe they were living on started breaking apart. Massive cracks split through the camp in the middle of the night. The men scrambled to save the lifeboats as chunks of ice the size of city blocks crashed into each other. They launched the 3 boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, into the freezing ocean and rowed for their lives. They were heading for Elephant Island, a desolate rock 100 miles to the north. It was the nearest land. The journey took 7 days, 7 days in open boats, with waves crashing over them constantly, soaking them to the bone. The temperature was below freezing. The men couldn't sleep. They couldn't even sit down. There was no room. They just huddled together, shivering, rowing, praying they wouldn't capsize. The youngest crew member, an 18-year-old Welsh stowaway named Percy Blackborough, made a critical mistake. He wore leather boots instead of felt boots. His feet froze solid. By the time they reached Elephant Island on April 15, 1916, he couldn't walk. He had to crawl through the surf. Elephant Island was barely an improvement. It was a barren, wind-blasted rock, home to nothing but elephant seals and penguins. No trees, no shelter, no chance of rescue. The island was nowhere near any shipping routes, but it was land, solid ground. The men collapsed on the beach. It was the first time they'd stood on land in 49 or 97 days, since leaving South Georgia back in December 1914. Some of them kissed the rocks, others just lay there too exhausted to move. But Shackleton knew they couldn't stay. If they waited on Elephant Island, they'd die. So he made a decision that seemed insane. He would sail back to South Georgia, 800 miles across the Southern Ocean, the most dangerous seas on Earth, in a 22-foot lifeboat. He chose 5 men to go with him: Captain Frank Worsley, the ship's navigator; Tom Crean, a tough Irish sailor who'd been to Antarctica twice before; and 3 others: carpenter Harry McNish and sailors Timothy McCarthy and John Vincent. McNish spent days modifying the James Caird, sealing the deck with canvas and nails reinforcing the hull. On April 24, 1916, the 6 men pushed off from Elephant Island. 22 men stayed behind, crowded into a makeshift hut built from the 2 remaining lifeboats. Shackleton's second-in-command, Frank Wild, was in charge. Every morning, Wild would wake the men up and say, "Lash up and stow, boys. The boss may come today." He said it every single day for 4 months. The voyage of the James Caird is considered one of the greatest small boat journeys in history. 800 miles, 17 days, through hurricane-force winds and waves as tall as buildings, 60-foot swells that could capsize the boat in an instant. Worsley, the navigator, could only take 4 sextant readings during the entire journey, because the sky was almost always covered in clouds. And even when he could see the sun, he had to be held steady by 2 men while the boat pitched and rolled beneath him. One wrong calculation and they'd miss South Georgia entirely. They'd sail past it into the open Atlantic and die. The men were soaked constantly. Their clothes froze solid. Ice built up on the boat, 15 inches thick, threatening to flip them over. 3 times, men crawled out onto the deck in the middle of storms to chip away the ice with axes, clinging on with one hand, terrified of being thrown into the water. At one point, Worsley looked up and saw what he thought was a break in the clouds. He shouted to Shackleton, that the sky was clearing. But it wasn't the sky, it was a wave. A rogue wave so massive it looked like a white cliff rushing toward them. "Hold on," Shackleton screamed. The wave hit like a freight train. Water poured over the sides. The men bailed frantically, convinced the boat would sink. Somehow it didn't. On May 10, 1916, after 17 days at sea, they spotted land, South Georgia. They'd made it, but they landed on the wrong side of the island, the uninhabited west coast. The whaling stations were on the north coast, 22 miles away across mountains and glaciers that had never been crossed. McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent were too weak to move. So Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean would have to go alone. They had no climbing equipment, no tent, no sleeping bags, just a coil of rope, an axe, and some food. They set off on May 19, 1916, and walked for 36 hours straight. The terrain was brutal: crevasses, ice cliffs, freezing fog. At one point they reached the top of a ridge and realized they had to descend into a valley before nightfall or they'd freeze to death. But cutting steps into the ice would take too long. So Shackleton made an insane suggestion. They would sit down, one behind the other, and slide down the mountain. They had no idea what was at the bottom. It could have been a sheer cliff. They could have fallen thousands of feet to their deaths. But they were out of options. Shackleton sat in front. Worsley wrapped his legs around Shackleton, and Crean wrapped his legs around Worsley, and they pushed off. They slid down the mountain in complete darkness, screaming, holding on for dear life, until they crashed into a snowbank at the bottom. Somehow they were alive. On May 20, 1916, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean stumbled into the Stromness whaling station. The Norwegian whalers didn't recognize them at first. They looked like ghosts, filthy and emaciated, their clothes in rags. When the station manager finally realized who they were, he couldn't believe it. Shackleton had been gone for 17 months. Everyone assumed the Endurance expedition was dead. But Shackleton didn't celebrate. The first thing he said was, "We need a ship." Now, he had 22 men waiting for him on Elephant Island, and he was going to bring them home. But the truly horrifying part, it took him 4 attempts. The first rescue ship couldn't break through the ice, neither could the second or the third. For 3 months, Shackleton tried desperately to reach Elephant Island, borrowing ships from Norway, Uruguay, Chile, anyone who would help. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, the men were running out of hope. They dug up old seal bones and boiled them with seaweed. They drank hot water mixed with methylated spirit. The surgeons, Alexander Macklin and James McElroy, amputated all 5 toes on Percy Blackborough's left foot using chloroform and makeshift tools. Blackborough joked the whole time. "At least I'll have a good story," he said. On August 3, 1916, the men on Elephant Island heard something. It was faint at first, a whistle in the distance. They looked up and saw a ship. The Chilean tug, Yelcho, with Shackleton standing on the bow. Frank Wilde shouted, "The boss is back. I told you he'd come." The men rushed to the shore, laughing, crying, barely able to believe it. All 22 men climbed aboard, and for the first time in 97 days, they were safe. Not a single man died, not one. In one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with no radio, no rescue, no hope, Shackleton brought every single member of his crew home alive. When they arrived in Chile, the story made headlines around the world. But by then the Great War was raging in Europe. Thousands of men were dying in the trenches every day. So the Endurance story, as miraculous as it was quickly overshadowed.